Agatha Vance didn't even look back. That was the part Lenora would never forget, not the cold, not the emptiness where the wagon used to be, not even the boot prints in the snow that told the whole ugly story. It was the stillness, the absolute, deliberate stillness of a woman who had made her decision and felt nothing about it. Lenora had been gone 40 minutes. 40 minutes to gather firewood like she'd been told. 40 minutes, and her entire family had packed what they needed, climbed up onto that wagon, and driven east without her. She was 22 years old, standing in 6 inches of snow with a bad hip, a small knife, and enough firewood to keep a fire burning for maybe 3 hours. The blizzard was already moving in from the north. Ask yourself right now, what would you do? If the people who were supposed to love you most decided quietly, without argument, without even a goodbye, that you were no longer worth keeping alive, what would you do? This story already has your heart beating faster. You are exactly who we made this for. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the mountain. The firewood was heavier than Lenora expected. That was always the problem with her hip, not the constant ache, which she had learned to carry the way some people carry old grief, quietly and without mentioning it. The problem was the way certain loads shifted the pain from dull to sharp without warning, the way her body would decide, without consulting her, that it had reached its limit. She'd been stacking split timber in her arms for the better part of half an hour, and by the time she turned back toward camp, her left side was burning in that particular way that meant tomorrow would be worse. She didn't complain about it. She never did. Not anymore. There had been a time, years ago after the wagon accident that broke her hip in the first place, when she'd cried in front of her father. Just once. She'd been 15, and the pain had woken her from sleep, and she hadn't been able to stop herself. And she still remembered the look on his face, not sympathy, not anger, just a kind of tired helplessness that told her, even at 15, that her pain was something he didn't know how to hold. So she'd learned to hold it herself. She was thinking about supper when she saw the empty clearing. Not right away. Her mind was still running through what she could do with the dried beans and the last of the smoked pork, whether she could stretch it another day, if she added more water to the pot. She was thinking about beans when her eyes moved to the place where the wagon was supposed to be and found nothing but flat, churned snow. She stopped walking. The firewood shifted in her arms, but she didn't set it down. She just stood there, because her brain was doing that thing it does when something is wrong but too wrong, when reality offers you information that you simply cannot process yet, so you just stand there. Holding firewood, looking at an empty clearing, the fire ring was still there. The stones they'd arranged 2 nights ago were still sitting exactly where they'd been placed. The shallow indentations where the wagon wheels had rested were still visible in the snow, filling slowly from above as the clouds moved in. But the wagon was gone. The horses were gone. Her father's bedroll, her stepbrother's gear, the supply crates, the canvas covering all of it gone. Lenora put the firewood down. She set each piece down carefully, which was strange. She'd wonder about that later. Why she'd done it so carefully, and then she walked to where the wagon had been and looked at the tracks. She had grown up on the trail. She knew what panic looked like in wheel ruts and hoof prints. She knew what a rushed departure looked like, the overlapping, chaotic marks of a family scrambling to move quickly because something had frightened them. She'd seen it twice before, once when a bear had come too close to camp, and once during a lightning storm that turned bad. These tracks were nothing like that. The wheel ruts were straight and deliberate. The horses had been walked, not run, not spooked, walked out of the clearing and onto the eastern trail. There were no frantic boot prints, no signs of items dropped in haste, no scattered debris from a hurried pack. Someone had taken time to tie things down properly. Someone had moved with intention. The tracks went east, toward the pass, toward the settlement they'd been traveling to for months. Away from her, Lenora stood in the middle of that empty clearing for a long time. The wind was picking up from the north, pulling at the loose edges of her coat, and somewhere above the tree line she could hear the low sound that experienced trail people knew to fear the particular moan that meant serious weather was building, not passing through. She thought about Agatha first, which probably said everything. Not her father, not her stepbrother's Agatha. Stepmother's face rose in her mind with complete clarity, that thin mouth and those pale, efficient eyes, and Lenora felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Because she understood, standing there, that she was not surprised. That some quiet part of her had been waiting for something like this for years. Agatha Vance had married Lenora's father 3 years after Lenora's mother died, and she had made her feelings about her stepdaughter clear through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions. The way she'd rearranged the wagon so that Lenora's pack was always at the back, always the last thing loaded, always the first thing discussed if they needed to lighten the weight. The way she'd say Lenora's name in conversation not with cruelty, but with a particular flatness, as if saying it was a minor inconvenience. The way she'd look at Lenora's hip when she thought Lenora wasn't watching, calculating, the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet. She'd heard them arguing 3 nights ago. She hadn't meant to. She'd gotten up to use the tree line and come back to hear Agatha's voice through the canvas, low and precise and utterly without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. She's going to get us all killed, Harold, not because she wants to, because she can't help it. The hip isn't getting better. It's getting worse. Every time the trail gets hard, she slows. Every time there's real work to do, someone else does it. And when the worst of the past comes, her father's voice, tired and thin, she's my daughter. She is. And I'm not saying she's a bad girl. I'm saying she's going to be the reason the rest of us don't make it. Lenora had stood very still in the dark and cold, listening. She hadn't gone back to sleep that night. She hadn't said anything the next morning either, which she now recognized as a particular kind of foolishness, the foolishness of someone who still believed, despite the evidence, that people who were supposed to love you would choose you when the moment actually came. They had not chosen her. She looked at the eastern trail one more time. The tracks were already filling with snow. Then she looked at her supplies. One worn coat, a little thin in the elbows but still functional. A small knife her mother had left her, the handle worn smooth from years of use. A flint and striker, half a loaf of hard bread wrapped in cloth. A handful of dried meat that would last maybe 2 days if she was careful. A wool scarf. She thought about sitting down. She thought about it seriously, because sitting down was an option, sitting down and waiting to see if her father came back. If guilt or love or basic human decency was enough to turn that wagon around. She gave that possibility exactly as long as it deserved, which was about 30 seconds. Her father had let Agatha send her into the timber alone. He wasn't coming back. Lenora picked up her pack, wrapped the scarf tighter, and started east. The first day wasn't as bad as she expected, which she later understood was the cold playing tricks giving her just enough hope to keep moving, the way it does before it gets serious. She followed the wagon tracks when she could see them, and when the snow covered them, she followed the trail itself, the old route she'd been walking for weeks. Her hip ached steadily, but steadily was manageable. Steadily she could work with. She made herself think about practical things. How many miles to the nearest settlement going east? Whether there was a trading post at the base of the pass. Whether there were other wagon trains coming through. She counted her steps sometimes, not to measure distance, but just to give her mind something to hold on to. Because when she let her mind go quiet, the other thoughts came in her father's face that morning at breakfast. The way he'd handed her the coffee without quite meeting her eyes. The way she'd thought he just seemed tired. He'd known. Even then he'd already known. She made camp the first night in a hollow between 2 fallen logs where the snow was a little less deep and the wind a little less direct. She got a small fire going with the flint ate a portion of bread that she told herself was enough, and lay as close to the fire as she dared. Bran slept beside her in her imagination. She'd always wanted a dog. She'd asked her father for one once years ago, and Agatha had said animals were a luxury they couldn't afford. The second day, the weather came in hard. She had maybe 4 hours of reasonable visibility in the morning, and she used every minute of it, moving as fast as her hip would allow, which was not fast. The snow was deeper now, past her knees in places, and each step through it was a full-body effort that pulled on her left side in ways she felt in her teeth. She stopped twice and stood still with her eyes closed, waiting for the sharpest edge of the pain to pass, and then she started again. By midday, she knew she was in trouble. The trail had disappeared completely under fresh snow, and she was navigating by instinct and memory, which were less reliable than she needed them to be. The temperature had dropped enough that her fingers were numb, despite the coat sleeves she'd pulled over her hands. She was rationing the food so hard she could feel the weakness starting, not yet serious, but the beginning of serious. The way hunger feels when it stops being uncomfortable and starts being something else. And her hip was failing. Not the constant ache she knew that pain had made her peace with it. This was different. This was the deep, grinding sensation of something structural complaining, the kind of pain that was a warning rather than a symptom, the kind her body sent when it was approaching a limit rather than just carrying one. She kept going. She told herself she would stop when she found shelter. She told herself the next rise would show her the lower trail. She told herself a dozen things that turned out to be wrong, one after another, and still she kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and the alternative was to die between the trees, and she was not. She decided this with a clarity that surprised her. She was absolutely not going to die, because Agatha Vance had decided she was disposable. The hip gave out between two frozen boulders just as the afternoon light was starting to go gray. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't fall screaming. One moment she was walking slowly badly, but walking in the next moment the joint simply refused, and she went down sideways into the snow and could not get back up. She tried twice, pushing herself up with her arms, and the third time she tried her arms were shaking too badly, and she understood, with a very quiet and very complete clarity, that she had reached her limit. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the sky. The snow was coming down hard now, big wet flakes that meant the real storm had arrived. She was between two boulders that cut the wind a little, but not enough. She had maybe 2 hours of light left, and no way to stand, and no shelter, and not enough food to wait out serious weather. She was going to die here. She was still trying to decide how she felt about that when she heard the footsteps. Not running, walking, steady, heavy footsteps in the snow that she felt more than heard at first, a low vibration that didn't fit the wind. Then a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a low, short sound like a command. And then, from between the trees, a shape that resolved itself slowly through the snow into the largest man she had ever seen in her life, accompanied by a gray dog with ice in its fur. The man stopped when he saw her. He was carrying a rifle and a brace of rabbits and wearing a coat that had clearly seen 15 winters. His face was half hidden by a scarf, but she could see his eyes dark, sharp, the eyes of someone who spent his life reading terrain and weather and sign. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The dog moved a step closer and then stopped, waiting. "Can you walk?" the man said. His voice was lower than the wind. Lenora looked at him. She looked at the storm behind him. She felt the cold of the snow against her leg where it had pushed through her coat, and she felt the grinding failure in her hip. And she thought about Agatha and her father and the straight, deliberate wagon tracks moving east without her. "No," she said. The man looked at her for one more moment. Then he handed the rabbits to no one in particular. They just hung there from the stick, and he crouched down and picked her up as if she weighed nothing at all, tucking her against his chest in a single movement, and turned back the way he'd come. He didn't ask her name. He didn't explain where they were going. He didn't offer reassurance or comfort or any of the things people were supposed to say. He just carried her into the blizzard, and the dog walked beside them, gray against the white, and the storms closed in behind them like a door. She woke up to the smell of smoke and pine, and something animal wet fur, and old wood, and something cooking that she couldn't immediately name. For a moment before she opened her eyes, she didn't know where she was. She was warm, which was wrong. She had been cold for so long that warmth felt like a mistake, like her body was playing a trick on her. Then the pain in her hip reminded her that she was still alive, and she opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn timber, low and darkened by years of fire smoke. She was lying on a narrow cot against one wall, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled like cedar and something she couldn't identify. A fire burned in a stone hearth big enough to stand in, and beside the hearth there was a cast-iron pot hanging from an iron arm, and whatever was in the pot was the source of the smell, some kind of broth, thin but real. The cabin was one room, not small exactly, but built with the efficiency of someone who had measured every inch against necessity. A table, 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves along one wall holding tools and supplies arranged with the precision of a man who lived alone and knew exactly where everything was. A second cot on the far wall, currently empty, its blanket folded with military flatness. Snowshoes hanging near the door, traps in various states of repair. Dried herbs bundled with twine hanging from a ceiling rafter. The dog was watching her from the hearth. It was lying with its chin on its front paws, those pale eyes tracking her without alarm, the way an experienced animal watches something it has already categorized as not a threat. When she moved, its ears shifted slightly, but it didn't lift its head. Lenora sat up slowly and immediately regretted it. The hip was stiff in a way that told her she'd been horizontal for a long time, not just overnight. Hours, possibly more. She got herself upright against the wall and sat there breathing through it, waiting for the worst of it to settle. The door opened and Cold came in first, then Gideon Rusk. He was carrying wood, a substantial armload, and he stacked it against the wall near the door without looking at her. He was bigger than she'd remembered from the snow, which was saying something. She'd registered him as large when he'd picked her up. But indoors, with walls to give him scale, he was genuinely imposing. Not fat, not soft, the kind of big that came from 30 years of physical work, dense through the shoulders and chest, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned not to bump into things. He pulled the scarf down from his face, and she got her first real look at him. He was older than she'd initially thought, somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been outdoors in hard weather for a long time. A scar ran from his left jaw toward his ear, old and white, and whatever story it carried, he wasn't offering. Beard was dark going gray, and his hair needed cutting. He was not, by any measure, a handsome man. But there was something in his face that she found herself studying before she could stop herself, a particular quality of stillness, the kind that wasn't emptiness, but rather the absence of performance. He didn't seem to need her to say anything, which she appreciated more than she could have explained right then. He went to the pot, stirred it once with a long wooden spoon, and then pulled out the chair nearest the fire and sat down and looked at her directly. "Hip's the old injury or something new?" "Old," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Wagon accident. 7 years ago." He nodded once, as if filing the information. "You were out in it 2 days. I was trying to reach the pass." "The pass has been buried since last week." He said it without judgment. "Nobody coming through from either side until spring." She absorbed that. She'd known it was possible, had known it even when she started walking, but she'd been operating on the logic of someone who didn't have a better option. Spring felt like a very long way away. "The family you were with," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked at the fire. "Gone east." Another silence. He didn't push into it. He stood and went to the pot and ladled some broth into a tin cup and brought it to her and set it on the edge of the cot within her reach, then went back to his chair. She picked up the cup. Her hands were still not entirely reliable, but she managed it. The broth was plain water and whatever bones he'd boiled, a little salt, but it hit her stomach like a promise. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She waited, because in her experience, people who had done something for you generally expected something in return, or at the very least wanted the story. They wanted you to explain yourself, justify yourself, make them feel that their help had been warranted. Gideon Rusk looked at the fire and appeared to require none of those things. "I'm Lenora Vance," she said, because the silence had gone on long enough that she felt the need to fill a corner of it. "Gideon," he said. "That's Bran." He nodded toward the dog. Dog's ears moved. And that was apparently the entirety of the introduction, because he picked up a trap that had been sitting at his feet and began working on the mechanism, and the cabin went quiet except for the fire and the sound of metal on metal. She should have found it unsettling, probably. A strange man, an isolated cabin, no way out until spring. She understood distantly that there were reasons to be afraid. But she was warm, and she had broth, and the dog was watching her without malice, and the man across the room was fixing a trap with total concentration and absolutely zero interest in her as anything other than a person who needed to not be dead. And after 2 days in the snow with a failing hip, and the fresh knowledge that her family had left her to die, the absence of threat was so profound she could have cried from it. She didn't cry. She drank the broth. Over the next several days, Gideon explained the situation with the economy of a man who considered words a resource to be conserved. The pass was buried and would stay buried. He had enough supplies to last the winter he'd prepared for one person, which meant that 2 people would need to be more careful, but he'd managed worse. She could use the cot she was already on. The outhouse was 12 steps from the back door. He'd cleared a path. She was to tell him if the hip got worse. That was it. That was the arrangement as he described it. What she noticed in those first days was what he didn't say. He didn't say she was lucky. He didn't say she should be grateful, though she was. He didn't tell her his own story or probe for hers. He didn't make any comment about her being a woman alone, which she'd braced for, or about her hip, which she'd braced for more. He just accommodated her the way you'd accommodate a change in weather. Adjusted and moved on. She was not easy about being accommodated. That was the honest truth of it. By the 4th day, she was moving around the cabin on her own, slowly and with care, and she'd noticed things that bothered her in a practical sense. The food stores were disorganized in a way that would make it harder to track what was running low. The mending pile near the second cot had gotten to a size that suggested serious avoidance. There was a crack in the wall near the east-facing window where the cold came through like a needle, and someone had stuffed an old rag into it that was no longer doing the job. She asked him about the mending first, because it seemed least likely to offend. "You got needles and thread?" He looked at the pile as if he'd genuinely forgotten it existed. "Somewhere. If I fix those, it'll help with warmth." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the shelves, moved 3 things, and produced a small tin that held a needle and a spool of brown thread and another spool of something heavier that would do for the coat at the bottom of the pile. "Help yourself," he said. She did. She sat by the fire and worked through the mending pile over the next 2 days, and somewhere during that time, she also reorganized the food stores and plugged the wall crack with a piece of leather she found in his scrap pile. And when he came home from running trap lines, the second evening, he walked in and looked around the cabin with an expression she couldn't quite read, and then said nothing and went to wash up. "You don't have to not say anything about it," she said. He turned around. "I was going to say thank you." "All right." "Thank you," he said. She went back to the mending. "You're welcome. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't smooth." She'd grown up in a family of 5 people in a wagon, which meant she understood close quarters. But this was different. There was a particular texture to Gideon's solitude, a density to it. Like a man who had been alone so long that his habits had calcified and other people moved around them the way water moves around stones. He had a specific way he hung his coat, a specific way he arranged his tools before sleep, a specific order to his morning's fire, water, animals Food that he followed with the consistency of someone who had decided long ago that routine was the only thing standing between him and chaos. She stepped on every single one of those routines at least once in the first 2 weeks. The morning she used his specific knife to cut bread, not knowing it was the knife he used only for field dressing he came in, saw it on the table with crumbs on the blade, and stopped so completely that she looked up from the bread and saw his jaw go tight. He started. I didn't know, she said. I'm sorry. Which one do I use? He pointed to a smaller knife hanging on the wall that she hadn't even registered as a kitchen knife. That one, all right. He picked up his knife and wiped it on a cloth and put it back in its specific place on his belt, and she could tell he was working at not making a larger thing of it. And she was grateful for that, even as she recognized how strange it was to feel grateful for someone choosing not to be petty. Her father had been petty, in small, tired ways that he probably didn't even notice anymore. 3 weeks in, there was a night when the wind got bad enough that the cabin shook in a way that wasn't entirely reassuring, and Bran, who had gradually migrated from the hearth to the foot of Lenora's cot over the course of the first week, put his big gray head on her feet and pressed there with a weight that was so specifically comforting she had to look at the ceiling and breathe very carefully for a moment. Nobody had done anything like that in a long time. Even a dog. She heard Gideon shift in his cot across the room. Still awake. Does it do this a lot? She said. The wind. Sometimes. A pause. It's not structural. How do you know? Because it's done this 20 times and the cabin's still standing. She thought about that. That's not actually reassuring. It's meant to be factual. She almost smiled. She was genuinely not sure if he was being dry or if he just didn't do reassurance, and she found she couldn't tell, which was interesting. Most people were readable in the ways that mattered to her. She'd learned early to read the small signals, the micro shifts of expression that told you whether someone was about to be kind or about to be cruel. Gideon was legible in some ways, but not in others, and the ways he wasn't legible didn't feel threatening. They felt like depth, maybe. The way a lake is less predictable than a puddle, not because it's more dangerous, but because there's more of it. She fell asleep while she was still thinking about it. She was learning things about the mountain. Not quickly. Quickly wasn't something the mountain permitted, but steadily, in the way that Gideon explained things. He didn't have a teaching voice. He had the same voice for everything, flat and quiet and precise. And when she asked a question, he answered it directly and waited to see if she had another. He showed her how to read snow depth for safety, how to tell by the angle of frost on branches whether the temperature had dropped overnight, how the direction the spruce were growing could tell you which way the prevailing wind came from. She was a quick study, which she could tell surprised him, even though he tried not to show it. "You've been on the trail for a while," he said one morning, watching her retie a pack knot she'd noticed was coming loose. "Almost 8 months. You know more than you think you do." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just another fact. "I know what I was allowed to learn," she said, and something in her voice must have been drier than she'd intended, because he glanced at her and she looked away. She hadn't meant to say that much. The hip was the thing she guarded most carefully, partly because it was genuinely frightening to her, and partly because she'd spent 7 years having it used as an argument for her limitations. She managed it on her own, the specific stretches that kept it from completely seizing, the particular way she had to shift weight on difficult terrain, the difference between pain that meant stop and pain that meant slow down. She'd built this whole private system of management that she'd never explained to anyone because no one had ever been interested in the management. They'd only ever been interested in the liability, which was why she was caught completely off guard by what happened on the day she slipped. It was a simple thing. She was coming back from the woodpile, and there was a patch of ice she hadn't registered under fresh snow, and her left foot went sideways, and she grabbed the wall of the cabin and caught herself didn't fall. Just went half down and caught herself, but the wrench to the hip was bad enough that she had to stand against the wall for almost a minute before she could move properly. Gideon had been at the woodpile himself. He saw all of it. When she straightened up and tried to walk normally, he fell in beside her, not taking her arm. She hadn't asked for that, and he seemed to understand she hadn't, but just present, within arm's reach. The way someone walks beside a person on an uncertain trail. Not helping. Just there. She said nothing. He said nothing. They went inside. But that evening, when she came in from the outhouse, she noticed that he had laid something in the snow along the path. Old straw spread in a thin line over the ice she'd slipped on, the exact width of a careful step. It had not been there that morning. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. She put it away somewhere private and kept going. The 5th week was when everything changed. And it changed so fast and so badly that later she'd have trouble separating the sequence of events from the feeling of them, which was just a long, cold spike of terror that stretched from approximately 8 in the evening until some unmeasured time in the very early morning when Gideon's fever broke and she sat back in the chair she'd pulled to his cot and realized her hands were still shaking. He'd come home late. That was the first thing. She'd had supper ready at the time they'd settled into by unspoken agreement, and the food had sat going cold while the light failed and the temperature dropped. And she'd stood at the window more times than she wanted to admit, watching the tree line for a shape that didn't come. Bran was restless, which was worse than the waiting. The dog paced the length of the cabin twice, and then went to the door and stood there. And Lenora looked at him and felt the cold in her chest again. The same cold she'd felt standing in the empty clearing where the wagon used to be, but different in texture. That cold had been the cold of betrayal. This was the cold of dread. When Gideon finally came through the door, she knew immediately something was badly wrong, because he didn't come through the way he always did coat off. Tools hung. Check the fire. He came through and stopped with one hand on the doorframe. And in the firelight she could see that his right leg was dark from the knee down, and that dark was blood. Too much of it, soaked through his heavy canvas pants and into his boot. She was across the room before she'd made the decision to move. What happened? Tree limb. His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort it was taking. Came down in the wind, caught the leg. Let me see it. It needs to be. I know what it needs. Sit down. He sat, which told her more about how bad it was than anything else he could have said. In 5 weeks, she had never once seen Gideon Rusk sit when there was a reason to stand. She helped him get the boot off, which took long enough that she had to set her teeth and cut the pants leg with her knife. And then she sat back on her heels and looked at what the tree limb had done and made herself one slow breath before she said anything. It was deep. Not to the bone she didn't think to the bone, but deep enough that it had gone through the muscle along the outside of the lower leg. A ragged tear, about 4 inches long, that was bleeding slowly and steadily in the way that meant it would keep bleeding until something was done about it. She stood up, went to the shelves, found the whiskey she'd noticed it 3 weeks ago and filed it under things to know the location of. This is going to be bad, she said. I know, I've never done this. He looked at her. Have you seen it done? Yes, on a horse. Something moved in his face that might, under different circumstances, have been humor. Close enough. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, which produced a sound from Gideon that she didn't think he'd intended to make, short and sharp and immediately suppressed. And then she threaded the needle with the heavy thread from the mending tin, and she stitched him, 8 stitches. Hands steady through each one in the way that her hands sometimes went steady in a crisis, even when the rest of her was not, while Bran pressed against her leg from the outside as if he could hold her upright by contact. When it was done, she wrapped it in the cleanest cloth she could find and helped him to his cot and covered him, and he was asleep inside of 10 minutes, which frightened her because it was that particular sleep that sat on the border of something worse. The fever arrived in the night. She did what she knew, cool cloths on his forehead and the back of his neck, getting water into him when she could, keeping the fire up, checking the wound, watching his breathing. There wasn't room in her for sleep, not with all the watching that needed doing. She sat in the chair she'd pulled up beside cot and she watched him through the long hours of the worst night. And somewhere around what she judged was 4 in the morning she found herself talking to him. Not because she expected him to hear, but because the silence was too big. She told him practical things at first, what she'd done for the wound, what she'd found in the supply stores, what she was planning to do in the morning about the water situation. Then she ran out of practical things and she sat quiet for a while, and then, without planning to, she told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, who had called her Nora in a voice that nobody else had ever used for her, who had shown her the mending and the cooking, and the 1,000 small survival techniques that her father had never thought to value, and Agatha had chosen to use as evidence of her function rather than her worth. She told the unconscious man in the cot things she had never said out loud. She told him she was angry. Not the quiet, managed anger she carried around like a piece of luggage, but the real thing underneath it, the specific, burning fury of a person who had been evaluated and found wanting by people who were not qualified to evaluate her, who had been left to die in the snow, not because she was weak, but because weakness was the story that had been convenient for them to tell. Gideon didn't respond. His breathing stayed labored, and his skin stayed too hot, and Bran pressed against her leg all night without moving. But in the morning, when the fever broke and his eyes opened properly, clear and present, and he looked at her, sitting in the chair beside his cot, and said, roughly, "You're still here," the way he said it. The specific weight of it told her something she filed away carefully. Not everyone who said that meant it as surprise. Sometimes it was something else. She handed him the water and said, "Drink," and he drank. And outside the winter pressed against the cabin walls with everything it had, and inside the fire burned with the wood she'd brought in herself. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, something had shifted that neither of them had a name for yet. She would not think about that. There were too many practical things to think about instead. The trap lines that hadn't been run in 2 days, the food stores that needed to be counted, the wound that needed to be checked and redressed that evening. The fact that Gideon Rusk was now the one who could not fully stand, and that the mountain didn't stop being the mountain just because the person who'd been managing it was laid up with 8 stitches in his leg. She pulled her coat off the hook by the door, his coat. "The snares in the East Run," she said. "Tell me how to check them." He looked at her from the cot. She looked back, Lenora. "Tell me how to check them." A long pause. Bran walked to the door and sat down, looking at both of them. Gideon told her. She checked the east snares alone that first morning, and it took her twice as long as it should have. Not because of the hip, though the hip was a factor the snow had packed unevenly overnight, and there were places where each step required a calculation, a small negotiation between where she needed to go and what her body would permit. That part she managed. What slowed her was the reading of it, the actual understanding of what Gideon had described from his cot in that flat, precise voice. He'd told her the markers a specific bent sapling, a rock formation shaped like a fist, the way the snare wire would be visible if she approached from the downhill side. He'd told her what a sprung snare looked like versus one that had simply been disturbed by wind, or a passing animal too small to trigger it. He'd told her how to reset without getting her sent too heavily on the mechanism. She'd listened the way she always listened, which was completely and without interrupting. But listening and doing were different things in the field, and she'd learned that again the hard way, about 40 yards into the timber, when she almost missed the first snare entirely because the bent sapling was bent in the opposite direction from what she'd pictured. She stood there in the tree line with the cold working through her coat and understood very clearly that Gideon knew this terrain the way she knew the interior of that cabin, not by thinking about it, but by having moved through it so many times that the knowledge was in his body rather than his head. And the gap between his knowledge and her ability to receive it through words alone was something she was going to have to close by failing at it until she didn't. 2 of the 3 snares were empty. The third had a rabbit frozen stiff, which she extracted with more difficulty than she'd expected and carried home with more pride than she thought reasonable. Gideon was sitting up when she came in, which was already more than she'd have permitted if she'd been consulted. He'd moved from the cot to the nearer chair, and he was sitting with his leg extended, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who did not like being stationary, but had been overruled by his own body. He looked at the rabbit. He looked at her. "One," she said. "Good start. The first snare, the marker's not what I expected." "Which part?" "The sapling bends left." "Not right." "You said right." He frowned. "I said it was on the right side of the trail." "I heard you say it bent right." He thought about it. "That might be my fault." She put the rabbit on the table and started pulling off her outer layer. "Tomorrow I'll know." And she did know the next day and the day after that. The knowing accumulated in her the same way it must have accumulated in him over years, slowly and through error, each mistake leaving a small deposit of understanding that eventually, piece by piece, built into something functional. By the end of the first week, she was checking all 3 snares in the east run without thinking much about the markers, moving through the route by feel more than by deliberate memory. It wasn't fast and it wasn't graceful, and her hip cost her time every single day. But she came home with something almost every morning, and the something was increasingly enough. Gideon watched her progress with an expression she'd learned to read as his version of being impressed, which was not very different from his version of being neutral, except that he asked her more questions. Not how she was managing, not whether she needed help. He asked her what she was seeing out there. What the snow was telling her, whether the rabbit population seemed to be moving or holding. He was teaching her, she realized. Not in the formal, patient way of someone who had decided to teach, but in the way of a man who couldn't stop himself from being curious about what she was observing, and whose curiosity was its own form of instruction. "There were tracks this morning," she said one evening. "Not rabbit, bigger, 4-toed with the rear pad like this." She drew the shape in the air with her finger. He didn't need more than that. Where edge of the east run? Coming down from the ridge. How old? She thought about it. Maybe a day. Maybe less. The edges were still sharp. He was quiet for a moment. Bobcat, probably. They don't usually come that low unless something pushed them down. What pushes a bobcat down? His eyes moved to the window, then back. Competition or hunger. She filed that. Should I be worried about the snares? Not about the snares. He looked at her for a moment. Don't go out alone after dark. I wasn't planning to. I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway. That was the closest he'd come to expressing concern for her directly, and she recognized it for what it was and didn't make anything of it, which she understood was the right call. His leg was healing, but slowly. She changed the dressing every 2 days the wound had stayed clean, which she was quietly grateful for every single time she unwrapped it, because she'd seen wounds go bad on the trail, and she knew what that meant, and she did not want to know what it meant up here alone in the winter with no doctor and no options. Stitches were holding. The deep bruising around the tear was moving through colors toward yellow, which was the right direction. He was putting weight on it by the end of the second week, carefully and with a walking stick she'd found in the corner and hadn't known the history of. Can you run on it? She asked him one morning. He looked at her. Why? I've been thinking about the bobcat tracks. They were 3 days ago, I know. She looked at the window, not at him. There were more this morning. 3 sets. Coming from the northwest this time. The quiet that followed was a different quality from his usual quiet. 3 animals, he said. I counted 3 sets of prints, so yes. Probably. Bobcat travels solo. She turned from the window. I know. That's why I'm asking if you can run. He stood from his chair slowly and tested his weight on the leg. She watched him without appearing to watch him. She'd gotten good at that. He took 3 steps toward the door, turned, came back. His face told her the answer was probably no. Not fast, not far. Wolves, he said. Not a question, I think so. I didn't get close enough to verify the size. He sat back down. She waited. She'd learned that his thinking process was not something to interrupt. He moved through problems the same way he moved through the timber, deliberately and without wasted motion. and the only thing that happened when you rushed him was that he started over. How far from the cabin, he said. Maybe 300 yards from the east run. So 400 from here, maybe. Time of day? This morning early, before good light, he was quiet again. Then, they're not hunting yet. They're learning the ground. That's what I thought too, she paused. But if they're coming down from the ridge because something pushed them, and they're traveling in a pack in the winter. They're hungry, he said it simply. Yes. She sat down across from him. The fire needed another log, but neither of them moved for it yet. So we have a problem. We have the beginning of a problem, he said. Which is different. She appreciated the distinction and also found it insufficiently comforting, and she said so, and something moved across his face that she was increasingly certain was amusement. Tell me what you know about wolves, he said. Not what you've heard. What you actually know. She thought about it honestly. They're smart, smarter than people give them credit for. They watch things. They test things before they commit. She paused. They identify weakness, and they wait. He was looking at her steadily. And your leg is a weakness, she said. That's the part that worries me. The silence between them now had a different weight to it, one that acknowledged something that neither of them had said directly until that moment that the equation of this winter had changed, when that tree limb came down, that the person who was supposed to be capable of protecting this cabin was currently unable to move fast enough to do it, and that the person who had arrived here half-frozen and unable to walk was now the one checking snares and reading tracks and watching the timber line at dawn. They were not the same two people who had arrived at this cabin. Tell me what you need to know, she said, to make a plan. He looked at her for a moment. Then he started talking, and she listened the way she always did completely. Over the next 4 days, the wolves made themselves known gradually, the way predators do when they're working towards something rather than acting from panic. She saw them directly for the first time, on the third morning, 3 of them at the edge of the tree line, standing in the blue pre-dawn light with the stillness of animals who were absolutely aware they were being watched and did not particularly care. They were thin, clearly thin, the way the late winter mountain made things that couldn't find enough food, and that thinness was the thing that frightened her most. A comfortable predator was cautious, a hungry predator was calculating. She went inside and told Gideon. He'd insisted on coming to the door by then, on standing in the cold long enough to see the tracks himself, and he looked at the 3 sets of prints approaching to within 150 yards of the cabin, and then turned around and went back in without saying what she already knew. The clearing was being tested. Bran knew before they did every time. The dog had a particular stillness that preceded the wolves' appearances, not fear exactly, but a complete and total cessation of all other interest. Every sense pointed at whatever was out there. Lenora had learned to watch Bran the way she'd learned to read the snares. When the dog's ears went forward and his body went rigid, she had maybe 3 minutes before something happened. It was on the 4th evening that the first direct approach occurred. She was outside, she shouldn't have been, but the water bucket had frozen and needed breaking, and it had been 2 hours since Bran had indicated anything and she'd judged it safe, which was a miscalculation she would not repeat. She was at the side of the cabin with the bucket when the biggest wolf came out of the shadows at the tree line and stood in the clearing at perhaps 70 yards and looked at her with that flat, orange-yellow gaze that contained a kind of intelligence she found deeply unsettling. It didn't charge, it stood. She understood in that moment what Gideon had meant about testing. The wolf wasn't attacking. It was measuring. It was looking at her the way Agatha had looked at her hip, calculating what was possible, what the liability was, what could be used. She did not run. Running was the wrong thing. She knew that from what Gideon had told her, and she knew it from something older than thinking, from whatever part of the human animal still remembered being prey. She turned to face it fully. She made herself bigger, raised the arm holding the bucket, took a step toward it rather than away. She heard herself make a sound that she hadn't planned, low and aggressive, and completely unlike anything she'd made before, and the wolf took one step back. Just one. But one. She backed to the cabin door without turning around, watching it the whole way, and got inside and put the bar across the door and stood with her back against it, breathing hard through her nose. Gideon had heard. He was already on his feet with the rifle. "It was alone," she said, "testing me. Did it come inside 100 yards?" 70, maybe. He lowered the rifle slightly. "You stood your ground." "I didn't have another option. You had the option to run." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said what they both understood, which was that she'd done the right thing, and it had taken real nerve, and she wasn't the person who had arrived here unable to walk. "We can't keep doing this," she said, waiting for them to get braver. "No, we have two problems." She set the bucket down. "Hungry wolves outside and not enough meat inside." He was quiet, that particular thinking quiet. "The snares are producing some," she continued, "but not enough to build any reserve. And if they get bolder, if they start taking what's in the snares before I can, then we lose both problems at once," he said. "Yes." She pulled the scarf off her neck. Her hands were still not entirely steady, so as I've been thinking about the alternative. She told him what she'd been considering. She laid it out in the same flat, practical voice she'd learned from him over these weeks. No drama, just the sequence of what they knew and what it logically suggested. The wolves were hungry and testing the clearing. They'd identified Gideon's leg as weakness. They were getting closer. If they continued on their current trajectory, a real attack on the cabin, not a testing, but a genuine assault, was a matter of days, not weeks. And when that happened, with Gideon still unable to move at full capacity, the math was bad. But there was another way to think about it. "The pack leader," she said. "If we could get a clear shot, without being able to move fast, I can't position myself outside." "You wouldn't have to." She looked at the window. The small window beside the door, its single pane of oiled parchment that let in light without much visibility. "If we opened it, if I draw them in close enough, if you're stabilized at the window." "That puts you in the clearing." "Not for long, Lenora." He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard from him before. "It turns one problem into the solution for the other," she said. "Clean shot on the pack leader, the others scatter. We have meat. The pressure on the cabin drops, and if the shot isn't clean." She didn't answer that. They both knew the answer. He looked at her for a long time. The fire settled into itself, and Bran shifted position near the hearth, and outside the wind moved through the timber with a low, sustained sound. "The window doesn't open far," he said finally. "Far enough. I'll need to be braced. The leg won't support me through the recoil without something to lean into." "I know. I'll set it up tonight. The light has to be right." "Morning, just after first light, when they're most likely to be active." "I know." She looked at him. "Is that a yes?" He looked back. "Show me how you're planning to brace me." She was up before the light the next morning. She hadn't slept much, had lain on the cot, while the plan ran through her head on a loop, finding the holes in it, trying to fill the holes, accepting the ones she couldn't fill. There were holes. There were always holes. She'd done enough living to know that perfect plans were plans that hadn't met reality yet. She had Gideon positioned by the window before the sky went from black to gray. The chair angled. The window latch loosened. Stack of folded blankets against the wall that he could lean his chest into and absorb the shot without the recoil torquing his bad leg wrong. He checked the rifle twice. She watched him check it. "You're going to walk to the middle of the clearing," he said. "Slowly. You're going to stand there and wait." "Yes." "If they come before I can get a clean look at the leader, I'll move back." "I know. Don't run even then. Move back, don't run." "Gideon." She said it the same way he'd said her name the day before, with that weight. "I know." He looked at her. In the gray pre-dawn light, his face was very serious and very still. "You're sure?" She was not sure. Being sure would have been stupid, and she was not stupid. What she was decided, and she'd learned. across a winter that had taught her more than she'd wanted to know about the difference between those two things. That decided was often enough. "I'm decided," she said. "That'll have to do." Something moved in his face. It was brief, and she might have missed it if she hadn't spent months learning to read a man who kept everything close. But she saw it. It was there for less than a second and then gone, smoothed over by that deliberate stillness, but she'd seen it. She turned and went to the door before either of them could say anything else. The clearing was bitter cold and absolutely quiet. Her breath came out in hard white clouds that the still air held too long. She walked to the middle of it, 50 yards from the cabin, maybe a bit less, and she stopped, and she stood, and she waited. She waited a long time, long enough that she started wondering whether the plan was simply going to fail before it began, whether the wolves had moved on in the night, whether she was standing in an empty clearing for nothing. Her hip ached steadily. She didn't move. Then Bran, visible through the crack of the open cabin door, went rigid. She heard it before. She saw it, the small compression of snow, barely there, like a sound on the absolute edge of hearing. She kept her eyes moving the way Gideon had shown her, not fixed on one spot, but sweeping, because fixed eyes missed the periphery, and the periphery was where things came from. The pack leader came out of the northwest tree line. She had seen it before at a distance, but close, this was different. It was larger than she'd understood from 70 yards, broader through the chest, carrying its starvation with a kind of terrible dignity that she recognized from somewhere she couldn't name. Its eyes found her immediately and stayed on her. That flat, measuring gaze, and it walked into the clearing with the unhurried deliberateness of something that had decided. She made herself be still, made herself be nothing alarming, nothing that moved or threatened, just a shape in the clearing that the animal needed to assess. She could feel her pulse in her temples and in her hands and in the persistent ache of her hip, and she breathed through her nose slowly, and she watched the wolf and trusted that 30 yards behind her, a man with a rifle and 8 weeks of healing and 12 years of mountain living was watching through a gap in a parchment window. The wolf came to 40 yards, then 35. She heard the shot the way you hear things when you're braced for them, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation, a loud, definitive sound that the mountain caught and rolled and gave back again from every direction at once. The pack leader dropped in the snow and didn't move. There was a pause, a fraction of a second that felt much longer, and then from the tree line came the sounds of the rest of them, crashing back into the timber, the sounds of things in flight, and then silence. Just the snow and the cold air and the smell of the shot still drifting past her. Lenora stood in the middle of the clearing and breathed. Behind her, she heard the cabin door, and then the uneven sound of Gideon's step, still not right, still favored, coming to the edge of the porch. She turned around. He was standing there with the rifle lowered, and he was looking at her, not at the wolf, and his expression was not the one she expected, which would have been relief or satisfaction. It was something quieter and more complicated. She walked back across the clearing toward the cabin. 40 yards felt like nothing compared to 2 days ago, and 2 days ago had felt like nothing compared to 5 weeks ago, and she was only now starting to understand that these comparisons meant something. "Good shot," she said. He looked past her at the wolf in the snow. "Good nerve," he said. She felt that land somewhere behind her sternum and made nothing of it and went past him into the cabin, and Bran pressed against her leg as she came through the door, and she put her hand on the dog's head without thinking about it, and the animal leaned into her palm like it had been waiting for exactly that. The work of that morning was hard and cold and entirely without ceremony. Between the two of them, Gideon handling the rifle and direction, Lenora handling the physical work he couldn't yet manage, they brought the wolf in and dealt with what needed dealing with. It was not pleasant. She did not expect it to be pleasant, and she did not pretend otherwise. The mountain ran on hard realities, and she had learned to operate within them without flinching too much, which was different from not flinching at all. The meat was real. The pressure was gone, at least for now. Two problems, and the solving of one had answered the other in a way that was not clean, but was sufficient. Sufficient was a word she'd come to have real respect for. That evening, with the cabin warmer than it had been in days, and something substantial finally in the pot, she sat across from Gideon and watched him eat for the first time, without rationing in weeks. And she felt something shift in the quality of the silence between them. Not because of the wolves or the plan or the shot, or not only because of those things, but because the story they'd both been telling themselves, even unspoken, about what she was doing here and who she was in this cabin, had run out of room to hold. She had not been rescued and held here. She had been here, present and functioning and deciding same as him. He put his spoon down and looked at her across the table. "You're going to want to move the east snares," he said. "After last night, the rabbits will have shifted pattern." "I know, I was thinking farther up the ridge." He nodded. "Give it 2 days first. Let them resettle." 2 days, she agreed. Bran was already asleep by the fire, and the wind outside was low for the first time in days, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But it was a different kind of nothing, not the absence of conversation, but the presence of two people who had run out of the need to prove anything to each other and hadn't yet figured out what came after that. Outside, the snow had covered everything clean. Inside, the fire burned down to its best coals, the kind that hold heat long and slow without requiring attention, and Lenora sat with her bad hip resting on the extra stool she'd started using without asking permission. And she thought about the wolf that had stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at her with that flat, measuring gaze, and she thought about Agatha Vance, and she understood that the thing she'd recognized in the wolf's eyes was not a stranger. She'd seen that calculation before. She knew what it looked like when something decided you were a liability worth removing. The difference was she hadn't stood in the clearing then. She'd been holding firewood, thinking about beans. She wasn't holding firewood anymore. Spring did not arrive the way people who had not spent a winter at altitude imagined it would. There was no single morning when the cold simply stopped, no clean line between one season and the next. It came in pieces, reluctantly, the way difficult things often ended a day that was almost warm, followed by 3 days of hard freeze, the snow softening at midday and crusting over again by evening, the light changing in quality before it changed in duration. Lenora had been watching for it since February, checking the south-facing slope behind the cabin, where Gideon said the melt always started first, and even knowing it was coming, even watching for it, the actual shift surprised her. She woke one morning in what she judged was late March to the sound of water. Not the creak and groan of the cabin settling in cold, not the wind that had been her constant background noise for months, but the specific quiet, unmistakable sound of snowmelt running somewhere beneath the surface of things, finding channels, beginning to move. She lay on the cot and listened to it for a long moment before she got up, and she felt something complicated in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Relief was part of it, obviously relief. The winter had been the hardest thing she'd ever survived, and she was not sorry to see it losing its grip. But something else was underneath the relief, quieter and less comfortable. Something that had to do with the agreement they'd made on the first day, when Gideon had laid out the facts with his particular plainness, and she'd understood that when spring came, she would leave. That had been the understanding. That had been the shape of the thing. She was here because there was nowhere else to be, and when there was somewhere else to be, the arrangement would end. She had not examined that too closely over the winter. There had always been something more immediate to attend to the snares. The food stores, the wound, the wolves, the daily accumulated work of keeping two people alive in a small cabin through a brutal mountain season. She had been, by necessity, very focused on the present. Future had been a problem for later. Later was apparently now. She got up and started the fire and put the water on, and Bran came to her feet the way he'd been doing since sometime around week 3 of the winter, when the dog had apparently made a decision about her and committed to it fully. She put her hand on his head automatically, the way she always did, and stood in the cold cabin waiting for the fire to take hold. Gideon's leg had healed. Not perfectly, she suspected there was going to be a particular kind of weather sensitivity in that leg for the rest of his life, the way old breaks and serious wounds left their signatures but functionally. He'd been running the full trap line again, since early March, moving through the timber with a stride that was still slightly uneven on hard terrain, but increasingly close to what she imagined it had been before. He came home tired in a different way than he had in the worst of winter, with the good tiredness of useful work, rather than the depleted tiredness of a man fighting his own body. He was in almost every visible way himself again. Which meant the equation had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them had said so directly. She had thought, more than once in those last weeks, about how to raise the subject. She'd run various versions of it through her head in the early mornings when the cabin was still dark and Gideon was still asleep across the room, and she had nothing to do but think. What she'd say, how she'd frame it, whether she'd ask him what he expected to happen, or simply start making plans and let the plans make the conversation for her. She had not yet landed on an approach that felt right. Partly because she genuinely didn't know what she wanted, which was a problem she wasn't accustomed to. She was good at knowing what she wanted. She'd had to be, growing up in a family that didn't particularly care what she wanted, learning early that the wanting itself was her own and had to be managed and protected from people who would use it against her. She knew how to want things quietly and clearly and without asking permission. But this was complicated in a way that the snares and the wolves had not been, because the wanting was tangled up with gratitude in a way she mistrusted, and with the specific confusion of having survived something alongside another person, and with the fact that she was 22 and had spent most of the winter in a single room with a man she had come to know in ways that were very different from the ways she'd known anyone before. She knew his routines the way she knew her own hands. She knew which silences meant he was thinking and which meant he was simply tired. She knew how he moved when his leg was hurting and didn't want to say so. She knew he talked more when he was outdoors than in, not much more but measurably, the way some people opened up with a task in their hands. She knew he'd been here 12 years and she'd never asked why, and he'd never offered, and she'd understood without discussing it that the shape of that silence was a boundary she was not going to push against. He knew things about her, too. She'd been less guarded than she might have been. The winter had a way of dismantling certain kinds of careful self-presentation, the same way sustained cold dismantled badly built structures. He knew about her mother, about the wagon accident, about the particular quality of her father's weakness. He knew she talked to herself sometimes when she was working through a problem. He'd caught her at it twice and not mentioned it either time, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. What they were to each other was not a simple thing to categorize. She was thinking about all of this while she was making breakfast, which was why she almost missed the moment Gideon came in from checking the south slope and said, without preamble, the thing she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. Pass is opening. She set the pan down, turned around. He was unwrapping his scarf, looking at the middle distance with the expression she'd learned to read as him deciding something. How long, she said. Week, maybe 2. Once the south-facing section clears, the first wagon can make it through. She nodded. She turned back to the pan and moved the food around in it without purpose. There'll be a train coming through early, he said. There's always one that pushes through as soon as the pass allows. They winter in the valley east of here, and they watch for the melt. I know silence. She heard him hang his coat. Heard the specific sound of him moving to the table, the slight irregularity in his step that was going to be there forever now, that she'd stopped noticing except in moments like this, when she was paying attention to everything. I've been putting aside some of the pelt money, he said. From this winter's trapping, she went very still. It's enough to get you started somewhere. A real town, not a settlement. Denver, maybe, or further west if you want. Enough for a room for a few months while you find work, and then some past that. She stood with the pan in her hand and looked at the wall in front of her. I know you can work, he continued. His voice was careful in the way it got when he'd thought about what he was going to say ahead of time. I know you can do more than most people would credit. You'd find something. She put the pan down. She turned around. He was sitting at the table and he was looking at her, with that face she knew steady and honest and containing whatever it was. He kept behind that particular stillness, and she understood, looking at him, exactly what he was doing. She understood it completely and immediately, and it made something rise in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. You've been planning this, she said. I've been thinking about what's fair to you. That's not the same thing as asking me what's fair to me. He met her eyes and didn't look away, which was one of the things she'd learned about him. He didn't retreat from direct confrontation. He just absorbed it, waited it out. Lenora, my father decided I was too much trouble to keep. She said it flat, without the heat she might have put into it a few months ago. He didn't ask me. He made the decision about my life for me, and he drove east. She pulled the chair out and sat down across from him. Agatha convinced him it was kindness, I think, or convenience dressed up as kindness. I've never been entirely sure which. Gideon was very still. And now you've put aside money for me, she said. And you've found me a destination, and you've decided that a town somewhere is a better life for me than, she stopped. Made herself finish it, than whatever this is. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear the water moving under the snow, that new sound of spring arriving whether anyone was ready for it or not. It is a better life, he said objectively, by most measures. By your measures. By any reasonable. Did you ask me? Her voice was still level. She was working to keep it that way because she'd learned over a winter that level worked better than raised. Did you sit down with me and say, Lenora, here are the options. What do you want? Did you do that? He didn't answer. No, she said. You thought about what would be best for me. You decided, and you were going to present it to me as a gift. It is a gift. The money's real. I know it's real. That's not the point. She put her hands flat on the table. I have been decided about my whole life. I have been assessed and evaluated and found wanting, or found useful, or found burdensome, depending on who was doing the calculating. I have never once been asked, not by my father, not by Agatha, not by the world in general. She held his eyes. I did not expect to also not be asked by you. Something moved in his face. It was subtle, and she might have missed it in the early weeks, but she'd had a full winter of reading him, and she didn't miss it now. It was the look of a man who had thought he was doing something right and was in the process of understanding that he was not. The leg, she said, last winter, when you couldn't move and I sat up all night watching your fever, did I ask you if you wanted me to help? Did I check with you before I put the needle in? That was different. How you were keeping me alive. And what do you think you're doing right now? She said. What do you think this gold and this town and this plan is? He opened his mouth and closed it again. It's the same instinct, she said. Wanting to handle the problem, wanting to fix it. I understand that. I have that instinct too. But I am not the problem, Gideon. My being here is not the problem. The silence stretched out. Bran, who had been by the fire, got up and walked to Gideon's side and stood there, and Gideon put his hand on the dog's back without looking down at him. Automatically, the same way she did. I'm not trying to get rid of you, he said finally. His voice was different now, quieter, and without the careful preparation she'd heard in it earlier. This was the voice underneath the planned voice. I don't think you understand what staying here means. Winters like this one every year. No neighbors, no town, no... He stopped. Started again. You're 22. I know how old I am. You have time to build something that isn't this. I might want this. The words landed between them and sat there. He looked at her. Really looked. Not the surface reading she'd gotten from him in the first weeks, but the deeper one she'd learned to recognize. The look he used when he was checking something against what he actually knew rather than what he'd assumed. "Do you?" he said. "Do you want this, or do you want to not be told to leave?" It was, she had to admit, a fair question. It was exactly the kind of question she'd have asked if the situation were reversed. She gave it the honest consideration it deserved rather than answering from reflex. "I want to not be told to leave," she said. "That's true." "But it's not all of it." He waited. "I know this place now," she said. "I know the East Run and where the rabbits go in late winter, and how the snow sounds when the temperature's about to drop hard. I know this cabin." She paused. "I know you, in the way that you know someone after a thing like this. And I don't know Denver or any town that size, and I don't have anyone there, and starting over somewhere else from nothing, I know what that is. I spent 22 years preparing to start over in a settlement out west, and look how that ended." Something like pain crossed his face briefly. "This is not nothing," she said. "What's here? That's what I'm telling you." He was quiet for a long moment. The water was still running beneath the snow outside, and the fire was burning steadily, and Bran was leaning against his leg with that particular dog patience that outlasted most human discomfort. "I have 11 years of being alone," he said. "That's not nothing either. That's built in by now, the way I move through a day. The way I need things to be quiet sometimes." He looked at the table. "I don't know if that changes. I don't know if it can." "I know you need the quiet," she said. "I've known that since about week 2. He looked up. "I don't need to talk all the time either," she said. "I spent a childhood in a wagon with people who talked over me, and it made me appreciate silence more than most people my age." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to become someone else. I'm asking you to tell me what you actually want." The quiet that followed was the longest one she'd sat inside with him, and she'd sat in some long ones. She let it be long. She'd learned that from him, actually the discipline of not filling silence with noise just because the silence was uncomfortable. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the fire. He looked back at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. So simple. 4 words. And he said them the way he said everything that was real, without decoration, without build-up, just the thing itself, placed between them. She felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated, and she could hear that he didn't quite know what to do with the fact that the conversation had gone this way, that there was no harder argument to win, that it was apparently that straightforward. "I'd want the garden," she said. He blinked. "What?" "South side of the cabin. The ground's hard, but it's workable if you start it early enough. I want a real garden, vegetables, not just root stores." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she'd never seen on him before and couldn't quite name. "You want to negotiate the garden right now." "I want to know the terms," she said. That's all. And then something happened that she had not seen once, not in all the months in the cabin, not through the fever or the wolves or the long evenings by the fire. Gideon Rusk almost smiled. Not quite, it didn't complete itself. Stopped short of full arrival, but it was there, briefly. In the corners of his eyes and the slight softening of a mouth that habitually held itself against the world. "Fine," he said, "the garden. And the steps need fixing." "The porch steps. They're a hazard. They've been like that for 6 years." "They've been like that for 6 years, because you don't notice them anymore," she said. "I notice them every day." "Fine, and Lenora." He said it with a weight that was not unkindness. "One thing at a time." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. And the thing between them that had been unnamed all winter, the thing she'd filed away carefully and not examined too closely, and managed not to give a name to, because naming it would have made it complicated in ways she didn't have room for. That thing was still unnamed, but it was also not pretending to be nothing anymore. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The first wagon train came through 10 days later. She heard it before she saw it, the specific, layered sound of a large group moving through the pass, Horses and wagon wheels and the human sounds of a camp on the move, voices carrying in the thin mountain air in that particular way, where you heard the sound before you could hear the words. She was outside with Bran, checking the south slope, and the dog's head came up and his ears went forward, and she followed his gaze to the lower trail and stood and listened. Gideon came out of the cabin behind her. They stood side by side in the early spring cold and watched the lead wagon come around the bend in the trail below, and then the second, and the third, and the whole long procession of people who had been waiting out the winter in the valley and were now finally moving again. She tried to feel something about it, and what she felt was complicated. Those wagons meant the world was open again, the world she'd been cut off from since a blizzard and a set of deliberate wheel tracks had stranded her on a mountainside with a bad hip and almost no food. She could join that procession. She could walk down to the trail and wave down the wagon master and ask for passage east or west, wherever the train was headed. And by summer she could be in a town with streets and shops and people who didn't know her as anything other than who she chose to present herself as. She could be no one's burden and no one's discovery, just a woman who'd survived a hard winter. She stood and watched the wagons and didn't move. For a while, Gideon said, "We need supplies. We should go down to the post when the train stops." "When are you thinking?" "Day after tomorrow, when they've had time to set up." She nodded. "I'll need to account for the winter's pelts," he said. "Decent season, all things considered. Better than decent," she said. "That east run produced well after I moved the snares." He made a sound that was his version of agreement. "I want to handle the negotiating," she said. He turned to look at her. "Pelts," she clarified. "I want to do it." "You've never negotiated a pelt sale." "I've never done a lot of things I did this winter." A pause. "The buyers will try to work you down. They'll see a young woman and assume." "Let them assume," she said. "That's when the advantage is mine." He looked at her for a moment with that measuring quality that she'd learned to recognize as respect rather than doubt. Then he looked back at the wagons on the trail below. "Don't let Harvin Coles near the beaver pelts. He'll grade them down on principle." "Which one is Harvin Coles?" "Short, red beard. Talks about his brother in Saint." "Louis more than any subject requires. I'll know him," she said. The day they descended to the trading post was clear and cold still, with that particular high-altitude brightness that made everything look slightly more vivid than was quite comfortable. Lenora wore the coat she'd repaired twice over the winter, and the boots she'd resoled herself with leather from Gideon's scrap pile, and she carried herself the way she'd learned to carry herself on difficult terrain, not minimizing the hip, not performing through it, just moving at the pace the ground required and not apologizing for it. The trading post was a low, long building that smelled of tobacco and fresh lumber and animals, and it was busier than she'd expected. The wagon train's arrival had brought a small temporary market into being, with traders and travelers mixing in the way of people who had all been isolated too long and were overcompensating with noise. She found Harvin Coles inside of 10 minutes. Red Beard talked about his brother. The negotiation took 40 minutes, and she came out of it with 19% more than Gideon had told her to expect, which she established by finding him outside, where he'd been talking to the wagon master and telling him the number. He was quiet for a moment. "Harvin tried to work you on the beaver," he said. "He tried. I told him I'd heard he was having trouble moving last season's inventory, and I didn't know if that was true, but I'd heard it, and I thought he should know people were saying it." She paused. "He paid full grade after that. Where'd you hear that?" "I didn't. I made it up." He looked at her. She looked back, and after a moment his expression did that thing again, that incomplete thing that lived in the territory of a smile. He looked away and scratched the back of his neck. "I need to get flour," he said. "And nails. We're short on nails." "I know we're short on nails. I made the list." She had made the list. She'd started it in February, when she'd taken inventory of what they'd need for the following year, not just the immediate winter recovery, but the longer planning, the thinking ahead. Flour, cornmeal, dried fruit, coffee, salt, lamp oil, New rope. Building materials for the expansion she'd been drawing out on a piece of paper since March rough sketches only, nothing precise, but enough to show how the south wall of the cabin could be extended to create a genuine storage room that would take the pressure off the main space. Glass for a real window, because the oiled parchment was functional, but it let in cold in a way that glass wouldn't. She'd been planning for the following winter. She understood, adding up the items on the list, that she'd been doing it without exactly deciding to. Inside the trading post, she worked through the list with the same focus she'd brought to the pelts. There was a woman at the dry goods counter who had been overcharged by the trader ahead of her and didn't seem to know it, and Lenora told her quietly, and the woman looked at her with surprise, and then with something that was just relief, and Lenora moved on. She was examining boots. She needed proper winter boots. Hers had been resoled twice and were reaching their limit when a man appeared at her elbow. Traveler by his clothes, well-dressed relative to the trading post context, with the slightly disoriented look of someone who had been on the trail long enough to forget what they were traveling toward. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "Are you with the wagon train?" She didn't look up from the boots. "No." "Are you from the settlement east of the pass?" "No." A pause. "Then if you don't mind my asking, where are you from?" She picked up one of the boots, checked the stitching on the sole, set it back down, and picked up the other. Then she looked up and past the man toward the open door of the trading post, where through the frame she could see the mountain rising above the tree line, the south-facing slope where the melt had started first, the familiar geography of a winter's worth of knowing. She looked back at the boot. "Up there," she said. The man followed her gaze, then looked back at her with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who'd expected a more complete answer and hadn't gotten one. He moved on. She paid for the boots with the pelt money and added them to the pack. Gideon was waiting for her outside with the mule they'd borrowed for the supplies, loading the last of the flour. He looked at the pack she was carrying and raised an eyebrow at the boots. "Mine are done," she said. "I know, you know. I noticed in February," he said. Didn't know what size till he stopped. She stared at him. "You were going to get me boots?" He picked up the mule's lead rope and said nothing, which was its own answer. She thought about that on the long walk back up toward the cabin, with the pack on her back and the new boots still unlaced at the top in the pack itself, and the mule plodding beside Gideon and Bran ranging ahead on the trail. She thought about the straw on the icy path, the lowered supplies. The window crack fixed with leather, the knife he'd cleaned without anger. The chair pulled to his cot and the water handed over without comment. The gold he'd put aside for her future, the boots he'd noticed she needed in February. She was going to have to figure out what to do with a man who expressed everything sideways. She understood that. It was not going to be simple or seamless or without friction, and she was not naive enough to think that two difficult people in an isolated cabin were going to suddenly become easy to each other, just because the wolves were gone and the spring had come. But she had spent 22 years having other people's simplicity imposed on her life, and she had not found it particularly comfortable either. At least difficult was honest, at least difficult was real. She adjusted the pack on her back and walked up the mountain toward the cabin that was already being imagined, in the rough sketches on the paper back on the shelf, as something larger than it currently was. Behind her, the trading post and the wagon train receded. Ahead, the south slope caught the afternoon light in a way she'd been watching long enough to read another 2 weeks, and the ground would be workable on the garden side. She was going to need seeds. She should have put seeds on the list. She filed it. She'd go back down when the train was still in the valley and find seeds. Gideon would say nothing about the additional trip, or he'd say one thing about it and she'd say one thing back, and that would be the conversation. She was already looking forward to it, which probably told her something about the nature of what she'd decided. The mountain rose ahead of them, indifferent and enormous, and full of the particular beauty of things that did not care whether you survived them. She had survived it. She had come to it broken in spirit, if not entirely in body, carrying the weight of being discarded by people who should have chosen differently, and she had moved through it one day at a time. One snare and one fire and one long night and one clear shot and one hard conversation at a time. She was not the same person who had stood in that empty clearing with a bundle of firewood and looked at wagon tracks going east. She wasn't sure yet who exactly she had become, but the mountain knew the shape of her now, and that was a start. She went back down for the seeds 3 days later, alone. Gideon had said exactly one thing about it. The trail's still soft on the north-facing section. Go around by the elk run, and she had said, I know, and taken Bran, because the dog had looked at her with an expression of such complete expectation that leaving him behind would have felt like a deliberate unkindness. They made the descent in good time, better than she'd expected, given how recently the trail had been impassable, and she found the seeds at the trading post from a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who was traveling with her daughter and had packed far more than she'd need and was glad to sell the surplus. Lenora bought tomato seeds, bean seeds, squash, and something the woman called a summer radish that she said grew fast and was reliable even at altitude. She also bought a small paper envelope of herb seeds, thyme, and sage because she had spent the entire winter cooking without them and had felt their absence in every meal in a way she'd never have predicted before the winter. Herbs seemed like a small thing until they weren't there, and then they revealed themselves as the difference between food that sustained and food that was worth eating. Mrs. Aldrich looked at the mountain behind the trading post with genuine curiosity and no particular judgment and said, You live up there? Yes, Lenora said. Alone? No. The woman nodded, unsurprised, and moved on to counting out the seed packets. And Lenora stood there waiting for the follow-up question, the social navigation, the careful explaining she'd already been composing in her head. The version of the story that was short enough not to invite more questions than it answered. It didn't come. Mrs. Aldrich quoted her a fair price, and that was the entirety of the exchange, and Lenora found herself outside with the seeds in her pack, feeling vaguely overprepared for a conversation that hadn't happened. She supposed she was still learning that not everything required defending. Bran was waiting where she'd left him, tied to the post outside the post's entrance, with the patience of a dog who had decided the world would get to the interesting parts eventually. He pressed against her leg when she untied him and she let him, because she'd stopped pretending she didn't like it somewhere around February. On the way back up the trail, she thought about the winter. Not the worst parts, those she'd already thought about more than enough, but the particular texture of the middle of it, the long weeks between the crisis of Gideon's leg and the crisis of the wolves, when the days had been hard and cold and repetitive, and there had been no dramatic event to navigate, just the daily accumulation of keeping two people alive in a small space. She hadn't expected to remember those weeks as anything other than difficult. She remembered them now with something that was not quite nostalgia, but was adjacent to it, the specific satisfaction of being competent at something real, of checking the snares and coming home with something, of stretching the stores another week through careful management, of doing the next necessary thing and then the thing after that without anyone telling her what it was or how to do it. She had been good at it. She hadn't known she was going to be good at it. 7 years of being treated as a liability had a way of making you doubt the inventory of your actual abilities, had a way of making you forget that the thing you were being judged insufficient for was other people's version of usefulness, not yours. The mountain had not cared about her hip. The mountain had cared about whether she could do what needed doing, and she could, and that was the only evaluation that had mattered. She arrived back at the cabin in the mid-afternoon to find Gideon on the porch with a piece of equipment she didn't recognize, something iron that had clearly needed significant work, his hands dark with grease and his carrying the particular absorption of a person deep in a mechanical problem. He looked up when she came around the final bend, looked at her pack, and then looked back at the iron thing. Get the seeds, he said, and some other things. What other things? She set the pack down and pulled out the herbs first, holding up the small envelopes. He looked at them. What are those? Thyme and sage. He looked at them for another moment. We managed without those. We managed, she agreed. That's different from eating well. He made a sound that was not agreement, but also not argument, which she'd learned was a particular category of Gideon response that meant he saw the point, but wasn't prepared to concede it immediately. She put the herbs back in the pack and went inside. The garden went in on the first genuinely warm day of April. She had been watching for the right conditions the way Gideon watched for weather, reading the soil temperature by how it felt under her hand in the morning, watching the south slope for the specific color change that meant the ground below the surface was softening. When the day came, she knew it, and she started before the light was fully up. It was not romantic work. It was not the kind of work that the people who romanticized the land from a comfortable distance would have found appealing. It was cold-handed and back-straining, and the ground was harder than she'd prepared herself for, rocky in the particular way of high-altitude soil that had spent years being frozen and compacted and frozen again, and working it to a depth that would actually sustain a garden-required effort that left her sweating in the cold air, with her hip aching in long, sustained waves rather than sharp spikes, which was actually a worse kind of aching because it didn't peak and pass, it just persisted. She'd been at it for 2 hours when Gideon came around the south wall. He looked at what she'd done, and looked at what remained, and looked at the tool she was using. "You need the breaking bar," he said. "I know. I didn't know where it was." He went away without saying anything else, and came back with a tool she'd seen hanging in the corner for months longer handle, heavier head, built for exactly this kind of problem. He handed it down to her, and she took it, and the work went meaningfully faster, and he went back to the trap lines without mentioning it again. That was the pattern of them. That was the daily texture of how they occupied the same space, the practical exchange, the filling of gaps without ceremony, the accumulation of small, unremarked acts that were not small at all when you understood that they were a language. She had grown up in a family where help was tracked, where assistance was a transaction that created obligation, where the giving and receiving of things was always also a negotiation of power. She'd been suspicious of Gideon's version for the first several weeks of the winter, waiting for the terms to become apparent, waiting to understand what he wanted in return for the broth and the cot and the firewood and the basic fact of not leaving her in the snow. The terms, as far as she had ever been able to determine, were that she would try not to die and would help keep the situation functional. That was the full extent of it. He was not banking anything. He was not running a tab. She had not, in 4 months of close proximity, observed a single instance of him reminding her of anything he'd done for her. It was so different from what she'd grown up inside that she had initially interpreted it as its own kind of threat. Now she understood it was simply who he was. By the end of the first week, the garden beds were laid in with sufficient depth. The seeds were in the ground. And she had already started planning the following year's expansion based on what she'd learned about this slope's drainage during the winter. The porch steps were fixed in May. She had been after him about them since the kitchen conversation, the one where she'd told him she wasn't going to be decided about, and he had sat across the table and admitted, with the plainness of someone saying something they couldn't unsay, that he didn't want her to leave. The steps had been part of the list she'd laid out in that conversation, not as demands but as facts. These are the things that need addressing. This is the shape of the life I'm proposing we build. He hadn't fixed them immediately, which she'd expected. He operated on his own timeline, which was not slow exactly, but was measured in a way that refused to be rushed. One morning, in the middle of May, she came back from the snares, and the 2 worst boards had been replaced with new lumber. She ran her boot over the solid surface, felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved, and went inside and said nothing, and he said nothing, and they had supper. But she'd noticed. He knew she'd noticed. That was enough. The cabin expansion was a different kind of project, longer, more complicated, involving 3 arguments and 1 near catastrophe, with the roof junction and a week where they couldn't agree on the drainage solution, and ate their meals in a silence that was a different quality from their usual silence. Charged rather than comfortable, both of them holding their positions with the stubbornness of people who were right in different directions simultaneously. She held her ground through all of it. She'd spent too many years not holding ground to abandon the practice now that she'd found it. On the 4th morning of the drainage disagreement, he came to breakfast and said, "We do the secondary slope on the east face," which was what she'd been arguing for since the beginning. And she said finally, which was probably not gracious, but was honest, and he gave her the look that had stopped pretending not to be amusement sometime in March, and they got back to work. The storage room was finished by mid-June, and it changed the main cabin in ways she hadn't entirely predicted. The space breathed differently, without the supply crates crowding 2 of the 4 walls. There was room to move, room to think, room to be 2 people rather than 2 people, and all the infrastructure of survival stacked in every corner. She walked back into the main cabin after the first day of using the storage room and stood in the middle of the floor and registered the change physically, as a feeling rather than an observation. "It's different," she said. Gideon was at the table, doing something with a piece of harness. "Yes. Better. Yes." She looked around. The window, the oiled parchment one, was letting in the long June light, and it was a different quality than the winter light, softer and more generous. "The glass window will change it again," she said. "Ordered it in spring," he said. She turned. "I know." "You told me. Should come in August, I know." She sat down at the table and watched him work on the harness, and thought about the window, about what it was going to look like to have glass where the parchment was, to see the mountain through clear material instead of the vague approximation that was all the parchment provided. She thought about the fact that he had ordered it, had gone to the glass merchant at the trading post while she was buying seeds, without telling her he was going to do it, without making it into a gesture or a statement. Had simply done it the way he did everything that was for her, quietly and from the side, as if doing it directly would make both of them uncomfortable. The summer was its own education. She had imagined the mountain in warm months as simply the winter minus the killing cold, the same terrain made accessible. It was not that at all. It was a different place in summer, the bloom of color across slopes she'd only known as white, the transformation of the clearing from an exposed and dangerous open space into something that felt almost sheltered, the shift in the animal's behavior and routes, and what the snares would and wouldn't catch. She was starting over in some ways, learning a new version of a place she thought she'd begun to know. She didn't mind. She'd come to understand that the mountain was not a thing you finished knowing. It was a thing you kept learning, and that was the nature of it, and you either made your peace with that or you went somewhere more manageable. She was not interested in more manageable. There were evenings in July when the light stayed past what she'd thought possible, the sky going from blue to a particular shade of orange that she had no prior reference for. And she'd find herself standing outside after supper, just in it, not doing anything, just being in the light. Gideon would come out sometimes and sit on the fixed porch steps, and she'd stand or sit nearby. And they'd be in the evening together without talking much. And she was learning what that was, what it actually was. Not just the absence of conversation, but the presence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them. One evening in late July, he said, without preface, that he wanted to tell her why he'd come here. She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge with that face that meant he'd decided something and was now committed to the carrying out of it. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said, and told her anyway. She listened to the whole of it, the woman named Clara, the fever year, the year he'd lost after, the fighting and drinking, and the things said to people that couldn't be unsaid. She listened without interrupting, which took effort at certain points, because there were moments in what he was describing where her instinct was to push back, to say that grief was supposed to do that to a person, and he should be less hard on himself about it. But she understood that he wasn't looking for that, and she kept quiet and let him finish. When he stopped, she sat with it. Clara, she said finally. What was she like? He was quiet for a long time, looking at the mountain. Stubborn, he said. She had opinions and she didn't keep them to herself. Lenora looked at the ridge. Sounds exhausting. It was. A pause that held something she didn't try to name. It was also the thing I didn't know I needed until it was there. Thought about saying something about her mother. About the particular grief of losing a parent before you knew what questions to ask. She thought about it and then kept it, because this moment was his and not hers to fill. You don't drink anymore, she said. Not for 7 years. Hard? He thought about it the way he thought about everything, honestly and without hurrying. The first 2 years, then less. There are still nights. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know, I've been across the room from you since December, she said. You're not loud about it, but I notice things. He turned back to the ridge, and she watched his profile in the last of the light and thought about what it meant to know someone the way she knew him, not the surface facts, but the actual interior shape of a person, the specific weight of their silences, the tells in their hands when they were thinking hard, the way they moved differently at the end of a bad day versus a good one. She had not known anyone like this before, not her father, not her stepbrothers, not any of the people she'd spent her childhood pressed close to in a wagon. Proximity was not the same thing as knowing. Knowing required attention. It required the willingness to watch without an agenda, to accumulate information about another person for its own sake, rather than for what it could be used for. She had, it turned out, been watching Gideon Rusk since December with a quality of attention she'd never directed at anyone before. And he had been watching her, and what had accumulated between them was the weight of being actually known. Which was terrifying, which was also, she had decided, worth the terror. You notice more than most people, he said. I had to learn, she said. When the mood in a house can change fast, you learn to read it early. He was quiet for a moment. Your father, mostly Agatha. My father was, she thought about how to say it precisely. He was a man who didn't have strong feelings and married a woman who had them instead. It made him easy to move, which made him dangerous in a different way than she was. You think about them, he said. Not a question. Some, she said. Less than I used to. She paused. I think I was waiting for a long time for them to understand what they'd done. To feel it. And at some point I stopped waiting when. Thought about it honestly. I'm not sure. Somewhere in the winter. I noticed one day that the waiting was gone, and I couldn't identify when it had stopped. He nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness, she said, because she wanted to be precise about that. I don't think I've forgiven them, and I don't know if I will. But forgiveness and letting go aren't the same thing, and I think people confuse them. I let go of the waiting. The anger is still there. Just quieter and mine now, not theirs to manage. Gideon looked at her for a moment with an expression she associated with him taking something in and putting it somewhere he intended to keep it. That's the hardest thing, he said, stopping the waiting. She looked at him, Clara. 11 years, he said. Not waiting for her, obviously, but waiting for something I couldn't name. Some accounting. He looked at his hands. Maybe just waiting to stop being the person who handled it the way I handled it. Are you, she said, done being that person? A long pause. Getting there, he said. Slower than I'd like. Slow's fine, she said. I'm not going anywhere. She said it, simply, as a statement of logistical fact, but it landed between them as something more than logistics, and she let it, because it was. The glass window arrived with the August train, Anne. Gideon brought it up the mountain in a wooden frame he'd built to specifications she'd watched him work through on a piece of paper over 3 evenings. Measuring and adjusting and measuring again, with a care that told her he understood what it would mean to carry a glass pane up a mountain trail and have it arrive broken. She'd watched him build the carrier without commenting on it, which had taken some discipline. The installation took most of an afternoon, and one moment that she would remember clearly for the rest of her life when the glass shifted in her hands and she heard it begin to complain, not crack, but that preliminary sound, warning, and she held it very still and said a word quietly that she hadn't said in front of him before. And from outside, he said, calm and immediate, hold it steady. Don't adjust, just hold. And she held it, and the sound stopped, and the glass settled into the frame properly, and neither of them breathed for the next 60 seconds while he finished the exterior seal. When it was done, she stepped back. Light came through glass differently than it came through oiled parchment. She had known this the way you know things you have not yet experienced intellectually, as a fact without a feeling attached to it. Now the feeling arrived. The mountain was right there in the window, present and clear, not suggested but actual, the ridge and the slope and the tree line that she had spent a winter watching through inadequate material. Now visible with a clarity that made her understand she had been seeing it at partial resolution before. She stood looking at it for a long time. Gideon came inside and stood beside her. She was aware of his presence at her shoulder in the specific way she was always aware of him, not consciously tracking, just knowing the way you know the temperature of a room. Good, he said. Yes, I should have done it years ago. She looked at his reflection in the glass, her reflection and his, side by side, slightly imperfect the way all reflections were, a translation rather than a copy. You weren't ready years ago. He looked at her reflected face. I meant the window. I know, she said. So did I. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice he used for things he had decided to say, rather than things that came out naturally, Lenora. She waited. I need to say something, and I'm not going to say it well, he said. All right. He looked at the window rather than at her, which she understood was not avoidance, but the same thing he did when he was processing something against the terrain, using the physical world as an anchor while the interior work happened. When I found you in the snow, you were between those two boulders, and you couldn't get up, and the storm was coming in. He paused. I've thought about that moment a lot this winter. What would have happened if I'd come down the east ridge instead of the west? If I'd been an hour later, I'd have died, she said simply. Yes. He turned to look at her directly, which cost him something. She could see that. This directness wasn't natural to him, and he was doing it because he'd decided to. And the cabin would still be here. My routine would still be here. Everything would be exactly the same. Yes, but it wouldn't be. He stopped. I don't know how to say what I mean. She turned to look at him. Try I was sufficient before you came, he said. I want you to understand that. I was sufficient. I was managing. I had a system, and it worked, and I had made my peace with what my life was. I know, she said. I could see that from the first week. But sufficient and this, he moved his hand slightly, a gesture that encompassed the window, the cabin, the two of them standing in it, the whole configuration of the past year. Those are different things, and I didn't know they were different. I thought sufficient was the full range of what was available to me. Thought the rest of it that he stopped again, that jaw tension she knew. I thought that was for other people, other kinds of people. Still, I don't say things right, he said. I know that. I know it's harder than it should be to be on the receiving end of someone who doesn't say things right. I'm not going to promise I'll get better at it. You're saying something right now, she said, with enormous difficulty. It counts anyway, she said. It counts the same. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that was not his usual contained steadiness, but something more exposed, and she didn't look away from it. She held it. She had learned that the thing to do when someone showed you something exposed was not to manage it or soften it or look away, but to simply acknowledge it by staying. She stayed. The window was yours, he said, from the minute you said it. He exhaled. I want you to know that it wasn't just practical. The window, the steps, the storage room, none of it was just practical. She had known that. She had known it since the straw on the ice, since the boots noticed in February, since every sideways act that had accumulated across a winter into a language she had spent months learning to read. She had known and had not pushed him to say it, because pushing too hard was one of her own bad habits, one of the ways her own particular damage expressed itself: the urgency, the need to establish terms quickly, because terms established quickly were terms no one could quietly revoke. But he had said it. He had done it the hard way, in words, with his jaw tight and his eyes on the window. And that was worth something specific, and she was not going to let it go unacknowledged. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She paused. "And for what it's worth, the garden isn't just practical for me either." His mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, and she looked at it and felt something she had no clean word for. In October, a young trader named Tate came through on the last run before the pass got serious. He came twice a year with leather goods and news from down the mountain, and he'd developed the comfortable familiarity of someone who stopped at the same places every season. He stayed for supper, and she made enough stew to share, and he ate with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been eating camp food for 3 weeks. He talked about the season, about prices, about a new family settling 2 valleys east, about the pass conditions. And then he looked around the cabin, the storage room door, the new window, the general organization of a space that had clearly been thought about by someone who intended to stay, and said, with the casualness of someone who considered themselves observant, "You all done a lot of work since spring." "Some," Gideon said. Tate looked at Lenora. "You planning to winter up here again?" "Yes," she said. "You've done 1 full winter up here?" "Yes." He looked impressed in the way of someone who had not done a winter up here and had some idea of what that meant. "And you're staying on?" "I live here," she said, flat and clear, and without the careful framing she would have used 6 months ago, when the words were still new enough that she felt she needed to present them rather than just say them. Tate looked at her and looked at Gideon and made whatever calculation he was making, and then nodded with the pragmatism of someone who had seen enough trail configurations not to be surprised by much. "Good stew," he said. "Thank you," she said. After he left and the cabin was quiet again, Gideon sat at the table for a moment. "You said it differently," he said. "Said what?" "Where you live." He looked at her. "In spring you said up there. Just now you said I live here." She thought about the distance between those two things. Spring version, looking at the mountain through the trading post doorway, pointing at it, still holding the place at arm's length in some way she hadn't fully acknowledged at the time. The current version, just a statement. Flat as weather. "I live here," the way you state a fact about the physical world. "In spring I was still deciding," she said. "You were decided in March," he said. She looked at him. "I was decided in my own head in March." That's different from being able to say it out loud to a stranger. The inside decision and the outside statement, there's a gap between those, and you have to cross it. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to things that were actually serious. "I didn't know there was a gap." "That's because yours work in reverse," she said. "You do things, and then you decide whether to say them." "I tend to decide and then figure out if I can do them." She paused. "We come at it from different ends." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that a problem?" "It's been a problem twice," she said honestly. "The rest of the time it's just how it is." He seemed to accept this. He got up and added a log to the fire, which was his version of closing a subject when the subject had been adequately covered. The first snow of the new season came in early November, 3 weeks after Tate's visit. She was outside checking the garden bed she'd covered them with straw against the first hard frosts, and was checking that the covering had held through the previous night's wind when it started. The tomatoes were long finished. The squash had produced so abundantly that she'd traded 2 of them to Tate and still had enough for the winter stores. The herbs had grown well enough that she'd dried them in bundles hung from the rafters in the new storage room, and the cabin had smelled like thyme for 2 weeks in September, which was one of the better things she could remember. The snow came lightly. At first, the tentative kind, small flakes that disappeared when they touched the dark earth. She looked up and watched it coming and felt not dread. She had expected dread, a residual fear left over from the blizzard and the empty clearing, and the 2 days of walking alone. It wasn't there. What was there was something harder to name. Kind of recognition, maybe, like meeting a version of something you knew. Gideon came around the cabin. She heard his step before she saw him. That slightly uneven rhythm, she knew the way she knew her own breathing. Early, she said. Maybe 2 days early. He looked at the sky the way he always did, reading it as a document. It'll stick. Firewood's good. Better than good. Storage is full. Better than last year, he said. Much better. They stood in the beginning of the snow, and she thought about the window, her window, with the light coming through it from inside, the particular warmth of firelight transmitted through glass. She thought about the garden beds under the straw, dormant now and waiting. She thought about the snare lines set and ready, and the herb bundles in the storage room, and the repaired steps that no longer had any give in them, and the expanded south wall, and all the other things that had accumulated since spring into the physical evidence of two people who were building for the future rather than managing the present. She thought about all of that, and she thought about the blizzard, about the clearing where the wagon had been, about the 2 days alone in the deepening snow, about the particular silence of lying between two frozen boulders and understanding that this might be where you ended, and the strange clarity that came with that understanding, not peace, nothing as tidy as peace, but a kind of honesty about what mattered and what didn't. What you would have wanted to do differently, what you would have wanted more time for. She had wanted more time. She had got it. Not in the way she would have imagined before that clearing, not in any of the forms she would have predicted her future life would take if she'd been asked before that winter. But she had got more time, and she had done something with it that was hers, and she was standing in the beginning of the second snow season with a man beside her who had stopped pretending that the cabin was the same size it had been when she arrived. And that was what more time looked like in practice. Not dramatic, not the resolution of a story, just the next morning, and the one after that, and the work that those mornings required, and the window through which you watched the light change. Gideon, she said, did you think about this at all? When you were carrying me in from the snow? Did any part of you think beyond that night, beyond getting her warm? He was quiet for a moment. The snow was coming a little heavier now, committing. I thought about whether you'd make it through the night, he said. And then when you did, whether you'd be able to manage the hip. And then I stopped thinking ahead very far. I do that when something's uncertain. I manage what's in front of me and I don't look past it. I know, she said. I learned that about you. You look past it, he said. It wasn't a criticism. I can't help it, she said. I've always been that way. Even in the snow, I was thinking about the spring. She paused. I think it's the thing that kept me moving when I should have stopped. What were you thinking about, he said, in the snow? She thought about it honestly, going back to those 2 days, with the intention of looking at them squarely. I was thinking about what I was going to do when I got out of it, she said. I hadn't decided what that looked like, but I was absolutely certain there was going to be a when. He looked at her. The snow was in his hair, the same snow that was in hers, both of them standing in it without moving, because neither of them had decided to go inside yet, and the decision hadn't been made to move. What did you think it was going to look like? He said. The when, I didn't know, she said. Something different from what I'd been. Something decided by me. She looked at the mountain above them, the ridgeline going soft in the falling snow. That was the only requirement I had at the time. Whatever it was, I wanted it to be mine. Is it? He said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her steadily the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen when he'd asked if she actually wanted to stay or just didn't want to be told to leave. That honest and slightly uncomfortable directness that he deployed rarely and with precision. Is it yours? He said. She thought about the difference between staying because you had nowhere else to go and staying because you had chosen to stay. She had had that conversation with herself in the spring, and she had had it again in the summer, quietly, without fanfare, and she knew the answer. had known it for a while, long enough that the question didn't make her chest go careful anymore. Yes, she said, everything that's happened since I stopped in this clearing and you carried me inside, I chose it. I chose to keep the fire. I chose to check the snares. I chose to stay that first spring when I could have gone. I chose the window and the garden and the arguments about drainage. She held his eyes. I chose you, you understand that, not because you saved my life. Because I looked at you across a table and decided you were worth the difficulty. Something moved through his face that she'd learned to read as the thing he felt when something reached him that he hadn't prepared a response to. I am difficult, he said. Extremely, she said. So am I. I know, he said. And the thing in his face shifted into the expression that she had spent the better part of a year cataloging and still couldn't fully name, the one that lived in the vicinity of a smile without completing itself, the one that was somehow more revealing than a smile because of its incompleteness. She reached over and took his hand. She did it the way she did most things she'd decided to do directly, without announcement. His hand was cold from the snow and rough from a decade of work, and he didn't pull it back. He looked at their hands and then looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. Inside, he said finally. In a minute, she said. He waited. She stood in the snow a minute longer, her hand in his, and looked at the mountain above them, enormous and indifferent, and full of the particular beauty of things that do not adjust themselves to human comfort. She had almost died on it. She had learned it the way you learned things that mattered, through failure and repetition and the slow accumulation of days, and she was going to keep learning it for as long as she stood here. Below them somewhere, down the trail, and through the pass and across the valley, and into all the distance between here and wherever wagons went when they drove east in a blizzard, her father was living his life. Her stepmother was living hers. They had made their calculation, the same calculation people made whenever they decided that another person was a liability instead of a person, and they were living inside the results of it. She was not going to spend the rest of her life being angry about that. She had decided this the way she decided things she needed to decide clearly, and without waiting for it to feel comfortable, because some decisions didn't feel comfortable, they just felt necessary. But she was also not going to be grateful for the abandonment. She'd seen that version, the narrative, where the terrible thing was actually a gift, where the people who hurt you had done you a favor. She rejected it. The abandonment had been wrong. The people who'd done it had made a wrong choice, and nothing that had come after changed the wrongness of it. What it had led to was real and good. The cause was still wrong. Both things were true. She could hold both things without needing to collapse them into a simpler story. She squeezed his hand once and let it go and turned toward the cabin. He opened the door, and Bran came out to greet them, pressing first against her leg and then against his, and she put her hand on the dog's back and felt the warmth of him against her palm and went inside. The fire needed a log. She put one on. Gideon hung his coat and came to stand beside her window, the glass one, and looked out at the snow that was coming down in earnest now, covering the garden beds and the porch steps and the trail down to the valley, beginning the slow seasonal work of closing everything off. She stood beside him and looked at the mountain through clear glass. Not suggested, not approximated, right there, present and enormous and knowable, if you were willing to spend the years it took to know it. She was willing. She had always been willing. That had been true of her before the abandonment, and it had remained true through the blizzard and the fever and the wolves and the long winter, and every morning she'd gotten up to check the snares even when her hip was bad and the snow was deep. And there was no particular reason except that the thing needed doing, and she was the one there to do it. She had never been someone who gave up. She had been told she was, or told she would be, told it in the 100 small ways that people tell you what they've decided you are, through the things they hand you and the things they take back, through what they protect you from and what they assume you can't manage. She had been told it by the people who were supposed to know her best. They had been wrong, and the wrongness of their assessment was not something she needed them to admit. She didn't need the confession, didn't need the understanding, didn't need the moment when they would look at what she'd become and recognize what they'd thrown away. She had the window, she had the garden under the snow, dormant and waiting for spring. She had the dog at her feet and the man beside her, and the sound of the fire doing what fire did, burning, without needing to be thanked for it, without needing to be understood. Just burning because that was its nature, and nature didn't ask permission. And she had herself, the full version, not the edited one that had fit in a wagon heading towards someone else's future. The mountain had not made her. She wanted to be precise about that, because there was a version of the story where the hard winter was the thing that created her, and she didn't believe it. She had been this person before the snow, before the clearing, before any of it. The winter had not built her. The winter had simply been the first place that required her to be fully what she already was, without the option of making herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. She was not smaller. She was not easier. She was, for the first time in her 23 years, exactly the size she actually was, in a place that had room for it. Outside, the snow came down. Inside, the fire held. The light through the glass window cast everything warm, and the reflection showed both of them standing there, their faces imperfectly rendered in the glass, recognizable but translated. The way all true things were when you finally saw them clearly, not simpler than you'd imagined, but more real. She was abandoned because others believed her broken. She ended the winter knowing something they never would. Being discarded was something that had happened to her. It was not a thing that was true about her. It was an action taken by limited people making a limited calculation, and it said everything about the size of their understanding and nothing at all about the size of hers. She looked at the mountain through her window, and she stayed.